The first time I truly saw fear for what it was, I was standing on a half-deserted train platform in the bruised light of an early winter afternoon. The air carried that particular metallic cold that makes every inhalation taste faintly of iron and old pennies, and my breath unfurled in small, quivering clouds that dissolved almost as soon as they appeared. I had arrived an hour early, partly because I never trusted timetables, and partly because I believed that if I hovered long enough beside the yellow departure board, I could somehow will the train to arrive on time, the universe to remain orderly, my life to keep its appointments. My hands were buried in the pockets of a coat that still smelled faintly of last year's cedar mothballs and this morning's burnt coffee. Each pocket was a small archive of worry, a crumpled receipt from the pharmacy where I had stood in line, rehearsing what I would say if my prescription was delayed, a half-finished to-do list curled into a tube like a secret scroll, a single copper coin I had picked up for luck, even though I no longer believed in luck. Somewhere between the rhythmic clank of a passing luggage cart and the hushed announcement that the 1417 to the city would be delayed by 12 minutes, I felt the first loosening, imperceptible, like a knot that has been tugged at for years finally deciding to sigh open. Fear, I began to realize, is not the sudden thunderclap that splits the night sky. It is a seed, small, patient, and almost polite in its initial appearance. It arrives disguised as prudence, as the voice that says, "Of course you should double-check the locks," or better to reread that email once more before hitting send. But the moment we grant it residence, it begins to germinate. Buddhism describes the mind as fertile loam, indifferent to what it nourishes. Plant a seed of calm, and the mind will grow lilies. Plant a seed of dread, and the same soil will obligingly sprout thorns. On that platform, I understood that I had been an unwitting gardener for decades, watering every possible catastrophe until my inner landscape resembled a wilderness of tangled undergrowth. I had rehearsed job losses that never happened, illnesses that never arrived, conversations that dissolved into nothing the moment they left the realm of speculation. Each rehearsal tightened the vine around my chest until breathing itself felt like an act of trespass. The irony, of course, is that the more fiercely we fear an outcome, the more we contort ourselves into its shape. Terrified of rejection, we begin to speak in apologetic half-sentences that invite the very dismissal we dread. Obsessed with the possibility of failure, we procrastinate until the project collapses under the weight of our doubt, thereby confirming our original suspicion that we were not, after all, equal to the task. We become unwitting prophets of doom, not because fate is cruel, but because fear is an exquisite sculptor of self-fulfilling realities. Standing there, watching my anxious breath fog the station window, I saw my reflection overlaid on the distant tracks, and for a moment the two images, face and steel, merged into a single wavering question. What if the catastrophe I am braced against is simply the echo of my own clenched fists? Letting go, I have learned, is rarely a single dramatic gesture performed on a mountaintop at sunrise. More often, it is the quiet accumulation of 1,000 small surrenders scattered across ordinary days. I began with something absurdly simple. I decided not to rehearse conversations while waiting in line at the grocery store. At first, the silence inside my skull felt like a drafty room whose walls had suddenly been removed. My thoughts ricocheted, looking for the familiar grooves of worry to slide into. But after a few days, the space grew less echoey. I noticed the way the cashier's eyes changed color in different lights, hazel flecked with green when she laughed, almost amber when she was tired. I heard the small, companionable sigh of the elderly man behind me as he balanced a single carton of eggs and a bouquet of daffodils. The world had not changed, only my attention had shifted, like a camera pulling back from a close-up to reveal the wider frame. and in that wider frame, fear no longer occupied center stage. Yet relinquishing control is terrifying precisely because it feels like stepping into an elevator shaft without knowing whether the car is there. Our culture equates control with virtue. We praise the person who color codes their calendar, who meal preps on Sundays, who has a 5-year plan, laminated and magnetized to the refrigerator. Surrender sounds, at best, like laziness, and at worst, like complicity in chaos. But Buddhism offers a radical redefinition. Surrender is not the absence of effort, it is the absence of coercion. Imagine holding a handful of water. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it escapes. Cup your palm gently, and the water stays. I practiced this with my teenage daughter's silences. Instead of interrogating her after school, I left space, an awkward, humming space, until one evening she filled it with the story of a friend who was cutting classes, a boy who had sent her a poem, a fear that she was becoming invisible. None of it surfaced because I demanded answers. It surfaced because I stopped insisting that the moment unfold according to my anxiety's timetable. The present moment, I discovered, is the one place anxiety cannot survive. Anxiety is a time traveler. It needs a visa stamped tomorrow or next week to exist at all. In the present, there is only this breath, this color, this sound. I began to conduct small experiments in radical immediacy. While washing dishes, I would notice the way soap bubbles hold entire galaxies of reflected kitchen light before they burst. While walking the dog, I would count how many shades of green one suburban block could produce in early May. Each act of noticing was like dropping a pebble into a pond. The ripples widened until the entire surface of my mind grew calmer. Mindfulness is not, as I once assumed, a special state achieved by monks on cushions. It is simply the practice of returning, again and again, to the only moment that is actually happening. The mind may roar, but the present whispers, and the more I listened, the more I realized that peace was not a distant summit to be conquered, but a shy animal that had been waiting for me to sit still long enough to be approached. Of course, the mind is a gifted novelist with a weakness for apocalyptic thrillers. It can spin entire sagas out of a single ambiguous text message, a slight change in a supervisor's tone, a twinge in the chest, whose Google search results inevitably lead to a rare, incurable disease. I began to keep what I called an evidence journal. Each night, I would list the fears that had occupied my thoughts that day, then note whether the feared event had actually occurred. After 3 months, the ledger was lopsided in the extreme. Roughly 80% of my worries had never materialized. 15% had turned out far less dire than anticipated, and the remaining 5%, well, those were the moments life had genuinely cracked open. Yet even in that 5%, I discovered resources I did not know I possessed: friends who appeared with casseroles, strangers who offered exactly the right words, a resilience that felt less like heroic grit and more like water finding its way through rock simply by persisting. The catastrophe I had spent so long bracing against had in fact been the doorway to deeper connection. Control, I learned, is often a form of amnesia. We forget that we are held by a web of relationships, rhythms, and unseen forces that have been carrying us since before we could walk. I remembered a summer afternoon when I was 8 and learning to ride a bicycle. My father ran beside me, his hand on the seat, until suddenly I realized I could no longer hear his footsteps. When I looked back, he was a small figure standing in the middle of the road, arms raised in triumph. I had been pedaling on my own for blocks, but the memory of his hand remained so vivid that I did not feel abandoned. I felt accompanied. Faith is the memory of that invisible hand, extended into adulthood. It is the quiet confidence that the same force that taught my body to balance on 2 wheels is still at work, even when I cannot see it. I began to experiment with intentional surrender on increasingly larger canvases. I volunteered for a project at work whose outcome I could not predict. I signed up for a pottery class, even though my previous artistic attempts had produced objects that looked like archaeological mistakes. I let the clay decide what it wanted to become, and the first bowl that emerged was lopsided, yes, but also luminous, glazed in a shade of blue that reminded me of the sky just after a storm has cleared. Each act of relinquishment carved out more space inside me, the way hollowing a flute allows it to produce music. I noticed that opportunities began to arrive without my having hustled for them: an invitation to collaborate on a book, a conversation at a coffee shop that led to a new friendship, the sudden intuition to call my mother just as she was sitting down to write a letter she was afraid to send. Life, it seemed, had been trying to reach me for years, but my hands had been too full of worry to receive its gifts. Anxiety, I came to understand, is a form of time travel that kidnaps the present and holds it hostage in an imaginary future. The mind becomes a projection booth, running disaster films on an endless loop. Buddhism's remedy is disarmingly simple: return to the body, the senses, the breath. I began to practice what I called micro-arrivals. Every time I noticed my thoughts galloping toward tomorrow, I would pause and name 3 things I could perceive right now: the weight of my feet inside my shoes, the faint citrus scent of someone's shampoo on the bus, the soft click of my neighbor's wind chimes. Each naming was like dropping an anchor until the present moment held steady enough for me to inhabit it. Gradually, the future lost its menace. It became simply the place where today's seeds would either bloom or not, and either outcome was bearable because I would meet it from the solid ground of now. I also learned to recognize the difference between planning and pre-living. Planning is useful. It buys train tickets, packs sandwiches, remembers to bring a raincoat. Pre-living, by contrast, is a form of rehearsal for disasters that may never be cast. I used to pre-live job interviews in which every question was a trap, medical appointments in which every test result was catastrophic, conversations in which every word I uttered was met with contempt. The energy I expended on these phantom scenarios was indistinguishable from the energy I would have needed to endure them had they actually occurred, which meant I was paying interest on debts I had not yet incurred. When I caught myself pre-living, I would gently ask, is this useful, or is this just fear wearing a mask of diligence? More often than not, the question itself was enough to dissolve the mirage. One autumn, I traveled to a monastery tucked into the folds of a mountain range whose slopes were quilted with terraced tea fields. The monks rose at 4 a.m. for meditation, and the first morning I joined them, my mind was a carnival of mental squirrels. But as the days unfolded, something shifted. The schedule was rigorous, yet spacious: chanting, working, eating, walking. There was no internet, no news, no possibility of micromanaging the outside world. I chopped vegetables in silence and noticed the way carrots surrendered their crispness to the blade, the way onions wept without apology. I swept leaves that had fallen overnight, and by afternoon they had fallen again, and no one scolded the trees for their untidiness. Slowly, imperceptibly, my shoulders descended from their habitual perch beside my ears. One afternoon, I walked to the edge of the compound, where a small stream tumbled over rocks, and I found a monk sitting on a boulder skipping stones. He handed me a flat piece of shale and said, "You cannot skip a stone if you hold it too tightly. You must release it at the exact moment the water's surface is ready to receive it. Timing is trust made visible." I threw the stone. It hopped 3 times before disappearing with a soft plink. The ripples spread outward, each circle wider than the last, until the entire surface of the pool shimmered like a living mandala. Back home, I began to treat my own life more like that stream. I set intentions, plant the seed, water it, provide sunlight, but I stopped digging it up every few days to check the roots. I applied this to a friendship that had grown strained after years of mutual disappointment. Instead of orchestrating a dramatic confrontation, I simply sent a postcard with a single sentence, thinking of you and remembering the summer we tried to bake bread and ended up with a brick. 2 weeks later, a reply arrived, a photograph of a loaf that had actually risen, captioned, "Tastes better when fear isn't the main ingredient." We met for coffee, and the conversation unfolded like a piece of music neither of us had written, but both remembered how to play. By relinquishing my script, I had made space for grace to enter. I also began to notice how often I had confused vigilance with love. I believed that if I worried enough about my daughter's safety, I could create an invisible shield around her. But worry is not love. It is love's anxious shadow. One evening she told me about a nightmare in which she was lost in a forest and heard me calling her name. But every time she ran toward the sound, it moved farther away. I realized that my constant check-ins, my imagined disaster drills, were not keeping her safe. They were teaching her that the world is fundamentally unsafe and that her mother is always half absent, scanning the horizon for threats. I began tentatively to practice what Buddhist teachers call sympathetic joy, the art of celebrating another's happiness without trying to manage it. When she came home, elated after a late-night drive to see meteor showers with friends, instead of interrogating her about seatbelts and speed limits, I asked what it felt like to see a streak of light arc across the darkness. Her eyes widened with the memory, like the universe was winking at us, Mom. In that moment, I understood that faith is not the absence of danger, it is the presence of wonder even in the midst of uncertainty. There came a day when I was invited to speak at a conference whose theme was uncertainty as creative force. Public speaking had always triggered a cascade of dread, sweaty palms, racing heart, the conviction that I would forget my own name. In the past, I had dealt with this by scripting every word, rehearsing gestures in the mirror, arriving early to check the microphone, the lighting, the exits, in case I needed to bolt. This time I tried something different. I wrote 3 bullet points on an index card, tucked it into my pocket, and spent the morning walking along the river that ran behind the hotel. I watched a heron, standing perfectly still in the shallows, waiting for the precise moment to strike. It did not rehearse, it simply paid attention. When my turn came, I walked on stage, carrying the memory of that heron. My voice shook for the first 30 seconds, then steadied. Midway through the talk, I forgot one of my points, and instead of panicking, I paused and asked the audience what they thought. The conversation that unfolded was richer than any monologue I could have delivered. Later, a woman approached me in tears and said she had been contemplating suicide, but something in the way I spoke about surrender had made her reconsider. I had done nothing special. I had simply stepped aside and let the moment speak through me. I began to see that the same principle applies to grief, perhaps the ultimate loss of control. When my father died, I tried to outrun the sorrow by staying busy, sorting paperwork, answering condolence emails, organizing memorial details. But grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a landscape to be traversed. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on his old workbench in the garage, surrounded by the scent of sawdust and motor oil, holding a coffee can full of screws he had saved, because you never know when you might need the right size. I began sorting them, brass, steel, Phillips, flathead, without any plan. The repetitive motion became a kind of meditation, and gradually the tears came, not the violent sobs of the funeral, but a quiet, steady leaking that felt like the earth softening after drought. I realized that surrendering to grief did not mean being consumed by it. It meant allowing it to pass through me like weather, knowing that storms are also part of the rhythm that keeps the planet alive. In the years since that first moment on the train platform, I have become a devoted student of small surrenders. I no longer check the weather app obsessively. I open the front door and feel the air on my face. I no longer force early blooming daffodils to open faster with heat lamps. I wait for the particular slant of March sunlight that tells them it is safe. I have learned that my body knows when to sleep if I stop staring at screens long enough to hear its signals, that friendships deepen when I stop auditioning for worthiness, that creativity arrives when I stop interrogating every sentence for its marketability. Each relinquishment is a homecoming, a return to the basic trust that carried me across the threshold of my first breath and will carry me across the threshold of my last. Sometimes people ask me if this way of living isn't frightening, if letting go feels like free fall. I tell them it feels more like floating. Fear still visits, but it no longer moves in. It is a passing cloud that darkens the sky for a moment before continuing on its journey. I have learned to greet it politely, the way one might greet an acquaintance whose presence is uncomfortable but familiar. "Ah, you're here again. Would you like tea while you tell me what you're trying to protect?" More often than not, fear simply wants to be acknowledged before it loosens its grip. The poet Rilke wrote, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms, and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue." I used to read that quote as a beautiful but impractical sentiment. Now I recognize it as a manual for living. The questions do not need to be answered. They need to be lived, the way a river lives its banks, without ever fully knowing where it is going. I have become less interested in certainty and more curious about surprise. I have learned that the same mind capable of catastrophizing is also capable of wonder, and the pivot between the two is often as simple as noticing the exact moment when I have started to grip the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles have gone white. In that moment, always available, always quiet, I loosen my fingers, exhale, and feel the current take over again. I think of the carrot seeds I planted years ago, the ones I nearly killed with my nightly excavations. They taught me that growth is not a report card I receive at the end of the semester. It is the slow, invisible work of roots that are never seen, but always essential. They taught me that my job is not to yank on the green shoots to make them taller, but to keep the soil moist, the weeds at bay, and the faith intact. Sometimes the garden fails, a late frost, an unexpected blight, but even failure is information, not condemnation. The next season I plant again, this time in a different spot, this time with deeper compost, this time with a slightly lighter heart. The rhythm is ancient and unhurried. Plant, tend, release, harvest, compost, plant again. Every stage is holy, even or especially the stage where the seed is still underground, apparently doing nothing, but in reality, undergoing the quiet alchemy that will one day split the earth and reach for the light. I no longer wait for the day when all fear will be vanquished. I no longer scan the horizon for a version of myself who has finally achieved permanent serenity. Instead, I practice the small, daily art of loosening my grip, trusting that the same force that spins galaxies and seasons and sparrows is also capable of carrying the unfinished parts of my life. Some mornings I wake with a jolt of anxiety about money, health, the state of the world. I place my hand on my heart and feel its sturdy drumbeat, the same rhythm that has been there since before I had language to name it. I whisper the simplest mantra I know: right now, I am safe. Right now, I have enough. Then I get up and make tea, noticing the way steam curls like a question mark above the cup. The day unfolds, as days always do, somewhere between my plans and the surprises that slip in, like uninvited guests, who end up being the life of the party. There is a Japanese concept called mei, which refers to the meaningful space between things, the pause between notes that allows music to exist, the silence between words that gives language its depth. I have learned to cultivate May in my own life, the pause before responding to a teenager's provocation, the breath between finishing one project and beginning the next, the moment of stillness before sleep, when I do not review the day's failures or tomorrow's tasks, but simply lie in the dark and listen to the hush that holds everything. In those intervals, I sometimes sense the vast impersonal tenderness that underlies existence, the way a mother's heartbeat underlies a lullaby. It is not mine to command, only to receive. And receiving turns out to be the most radical act of all, because it requires the humility to admit that I am not the author of every breath, only the grateful reader. Last week, I found myself once again on a train platform, this time in late spring. The air smelled of lilacs and diesel, and the sky was a reckless blue. I was early again. Old habits die hard, but the difference was that I was not trying to control the train's arrival. I was watching a toddler drop pebbles between the slats of the bench, each stone disappearing with a satisfying clack. His mother sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up to smile. I thought of all the pebbles of worry I had dropped into the void, the hours I had spent trying to retrieve them. I thought of how the toddler trusted the gap to receive his offering without demanding proof of where it landed. When the train finally pulled in, its doors opened with a pneumatic sigh that sounded almost like relief. I stepped aboard, found a seat beside a window, and as the landscape began to slide past backyards with laundry flapping, a river flashing silver, a sudden burst of redbud trees, I felt the old familiar loosening again, only now it was no longer new, it was simply home. Life, I have come to understand, is not a problem to be solved, but a rhythm to be entered. The heart beats, the lungs inflate, the seasons turn, the tides rise and fall, all without my supervision. My task is to notice when I have stepped out of rhythm and to step back in, usually by doing less rather than more. The Buddha's last words were reportedly, "Make of yourself a light." I used to think that meant achieving a state of unassailable radiance. Now I think it means learning to glow gently, the way a firefly does, on, off, trusting the darkness as much as the light. Tonight I will sit on the back porch as the stars emerge, one by one, like shy guests at a party. I will not count them or name their constellations. I will simply let them be there, the way they have always been there, long before I arrived, and long after I am gone. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle will sound, and I will remember that platform, that cold air, that first loosening. I will remember that fear is a seed, yes, but so is courage, so is wonder, so is love, and the mind is a garden, generous enough to grow them all. If only I remember to tend it with presence, instead of panic, with curiosity, instead of control. The work is never finished, the garden is never complete. But the moon will rise anyway, silvering the leaves, and the wind will carry the scent of honeysuckle across the yard, and the small, persistent pulse under my ribs will keep time with the universe's own slow heartbeat. That is enough. That is everything.